Zhang Yuji was a 23-year-old scholar preparing for imperial examinations when the guards came. 3 days later, he was screaming in a palace chamber while physicians castrated him with bronze blades. He wasn't accused of any crime. His only offense? His mother criticized Wu Zetian, China's only female emperor, at a private dinner. Zhang was one of over 300 young men Wu kidnapped, mutilated, and imprisoned in history's darkest secret, the male harem. This is what historians try to erase. In this video, you'll discover the true horror of China's only female emperor and the male harem she created through terror and mutilation. You'll learn about the selection process that turned noblemen into slaves, the brutal castration rituals performed without anesthesia, and the twisted power games that left hundreds dead. But the most disturbing part isn't what she did to their bodies, it's what she did to their minds. And I warn you, some of these historical accounts are so graphic that Chinese scholars still debate whether they should be taught. This is the story they tried to erase. The year is 690 AD. China's Tang dynasty stands at its peak. Poetry flourishes, trade routes connect empires, Buddhism spreads across Silk Roads. Into this golden age steps Wu Zetian, a former concubine who claws her way to absolute power through political genius and calculated brutality. She becomes the only woman in 4,000 years of Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own right. She was 65 years old, and her appetite was just beginning. But Wu Zetian has a problem. For centuries, Chinese emperors maintained harems of hundreds, sometimes thousands of women, concubines who existed solely for imperial pleasure and producing heirs. These women had no voice, no agency, no escape. Now Wu sits on the dragon throne, and she wants revenge. The historical records from this period suddenly become vague. Official chronicles mention attendants and companions. Buddhist texts refer to devoted servants in the inner palace. The documents were hidden for a reason. What they describe violates every human boundary. But excavated documents from the 1970s reveal something historians had long suspected but never confirmed. Wu Zetian created China's first and only male harem. She called them her Mian Shou, literally beautiful faces. Beautiful, broken, and trapped forever. The first were volunteers, ambitious young men from noble families who believed serving the Empress intimately would bring power and wealth. Volunteers. They were wrong. Within 6 months of the program's start, the volunteers stopped coming. The hunting began on a Tuesday. By Friday, 12 men had vanished, so Wu's secret police began hunting. Zhang Yuji was 23 when they came for him, a scholar from Henan province, educated in Confucian classics, preparing for imperial examinations. His crime? His mother had criticized Wu Zetian at a private dinner party. Someone reported her. 3 days later, imperial guards dragged Zhang from his bed at dawn. They didn't tell him where they were going. The journey to Luoyang, 340 kilometers over 8 days, an average of 42 kilometers daily, chained in a wooden cart that measured 2 meters by 1 meter. Zhang spent it wondering if he'd be executed like so many of Wu's political enemies. Execution would have been mercy. When he arrived at the Forbidden City, eunuchs stripped him naked and examined him like livestock. They measured him at exactly 5 chi 7 kun, 177 centimeters. They counted his teeth, 31, one missing molar. They recorded a small scar on his left shoulder. Then they asked him one question: will you serve the divine Empress with your body and soul? Zhang, terrified and confused, said yes. He said yes. He didn't understand what he was agreeing to. The eunuchs smiled. What happened next was standard procedure for all of Wu's Mian Shou. They took Zhang to a chamber deep within the palace, a room that smelled of blood and burning herbs. Other young men waited there, perhaps 20 of them, all naked, all terrified. Some were crying. An elderly physician entered carrying a wooden box. Inside the box were bronze blades, silk cords, and a clay pot filled with a thick, dark paste.
The physician's assistant began mixing the paste with wine, a primitive anesthetic made from sesame oil, musk, and opium. It wasn't nearly strong enough for what was coming. The physician looked at Zhang with professional detachment and said words that appear in 3 separate historical accounts. "You belong to the Empress now. We must prepare you." They held him down while he screamed. But what happened next changed everything. The castration of Wu Zetian's Mian Shou wasn't the crude removal performed on traditional eunuchs, not servants, but slaves. Wu had studied the practices of imperial harems for decades. She knew that concubines were often given herbs to increase fertility, drugs to enhance beauty, and aphrodisiacs to heighten desire. She demanded the same science be applied to her male companions, but inverted, perverted, designed to create perfect slaves. Court physician Yuan Weilang developed what he called the purification ritual, not medicine, but mutilation. They called it purification. They performed it in a room that smelled like a temple, incense and prayers, but it was a slaughterhouse. They sanctified mutilation and called it holy. Historical medical texts from the period describe the procedure in clinical detail. First, the victim was forced to drink large quantities of the opium wine mixture until barely conscious. Then his genitals were tightly bound with silk cords to reduce blood flow. The binding stayed in place for 2 hours while the tissue began to die. The actual cutting came next. Unlike standard eunuch castration, which removed everything external, Wu's procedure was more selective. The physicians removed the testicles but left the penis partially intact, damaged, scarred, but functional enough for the Empress's purposes. The goal wasn't to create sexless servants. It was to create men who could still perform sexually, but who could never father children, never threaten her lineage, never have the hormonal aggression to resist her. The wound was cauterized with heated copper plates, the burning smell mixed with incense that filled the chamber. Then came the paste, packed into the wound to prevent infection. Mortality rate, 20% from hemorrhagic shock within 6 hours. Another 30% from septicemia within 14 days. Survival rate, exactly 50%. Zhang Yuji survived. The physical wounds healed in 40 days. The psychological ones never would. Other men recovered in cells nearby. Sometimes Zhang heard them weeping. Sometimes they heard them trying to kill themselves. The guards always intervened. The guards always intervened in time. During recovery, the indoctrination began. While Zhang lay recovering in his cell, 40 other men were going through the same indoctrination across the northern palace. Buddhist monks visited each one. The same words, the same prayers, the same psychological breaking. This wasn't individual counseling. This was industry-scale mind control. Buddhist monks visited daily, teaching the Mian Shou that they had been purified for a sacred purpose, to serve the living incarnation of Maitreya Buddha. That's how Wu Zetian styled herself, not merely an emperor, but a divine incarnation in human form. The monks explained that the pain was necessary, that suffering brought enlightenment, that service to the Empress was service to heaven itself. When Zhang was finally summoned to Wu's private chambers, he could barely walk. 2 eunuchs had to support him as they led him through corridors of polished jade and gold leaf screens. He expected a throne room, an audience hall, some formal space. Instead, they brought him to a bedroom. Wu Zetian, 67 years old, ruling for 15 years, with a documented harem that began with 23 men in 690 and expanded to 312 by 698. She reclined on silk cushions, wearing robes that revealed more than they concealed. Incense smoke coiled through the air, and she looked at Zhang not as an empress viewing a subject, but as a collector admiring a newly acquired treasure. She spoke to him in a voice that was gentle, almost maternal. "You've been through so much pain, my beautiful one. Now let me show you pleasure." I thought, this is pleasure? My body responds, but my soul screams. She touches me like I'm precious, while treating me like I'm nothing. I am her treasure. I am her slave. I am both. I am neither. I am no longer myself. Now you might be wondering, how could this happen? How could one woman wield such absolute power that she could mutilate hundreds of men without consequence? The answer is more disturbing than you can imagine. Wu Zetian didn't just control the government, she controlled reality itself. At its peak, Wu Zetian's male harem contained over 300 mianshou. They lived in a sealed section of the Forbidden City called the Northern Palace, a complex of courtyards, gardens, and dormitories where no one entered under Wu's permission. Eunuchs guarded every entrance, walls stood 20 feet high. It was a prison disguised as paradise. The daily life of a mianshou was carefully regimented. They woke at dawn for Buddhist chanting. Then came physical training, not martial arts, but flexibility exercises, endurance building, practices designed to make them better bed partners. Mornings were spent learning poetry, music, and conversation.
A controversial theory proposed by historian Chen Xiaoli suggests that many mianshou were actually murdered in the immediate aftermath of Wu's death. Chen points to a mass grave discovered in 1992 near Luoyang that contained the remains of approximately 200 men, all aged between 20 and 40, all showing signs of castration, all buried at roughly the same time, around 705–706 AD. The official Chinese historical establishment rejected Chen's theory, claiming the grave contained criminals or plague victims, but forensic analysis revealed something chilling. 1992, 127 of 198 skulls showed C2-C3 vertebral fracture, signature of ligature strangulation using silk cord, consistent with imperial execution protocols. Many of the skulls showed trauma consistent with execution by strangulation. Their hands had been bound with silk rope, a detail that matches descriptions of how palace servants were restrained. Chen's controversial conclusion, Emperor Zhongzong ordered a mass execution of Wu's mianshou and covered it up as a dispersal to monasteries. Only a few dozen were actually sent to temples, the ones with powerful family connections who couldn't simply disappear. The rest were killed and dumped in unmarked graves. That mass grave near Luoyang, it's not the only one. Ground-penetrating radar surveys in 2004 identified 6 similar sites within a 50-kilometer radius. The Chinese government classified the data immediately. What are they hiding? How many more? If Chen is right, then the male harem story ended not with decades of monastery captivity, but with a single night of mass murder. The Chinese government has refused to allow further excavation of the site, so we may never know the truth. What we do know is this: after Wu Zetian's death, all references to her mianshou were systematically removed from official histories. Not history, but erasure. Erasure. Scholars who mentioned them too explicitly found their work censored. The practice of maintaining a male harem was never repeated by any subsequent ruler. History tried hiding. It was as if China's historians collectively decided that this chapter of history was too shameful to remember. For over 1,000 years, the male harem existed only in whispers and fragments, until modern archaeology began uncovering the evidence historians tried to bury. But here's the part that makes this story truly horrifying, the detail that historians still debate in hushed tones. Wu Zetian's mianshou weren't just victims. Many of them became perpetrators. Recently translated documents from the Da Zhao Golden Cabinet archives reveal that Wu used her most favored mianshou as secret police and enforcers. They carried out arrests, supervised torture sessions, and eliminated her political enemies. The very men who had been mutilated and enslaved became instruments of mutilation and enslavement for others. The Jiang brothers, Jiang Yizhi and Jiang Chongzong, were the most powerful of Wu's companions. Historical records describe them as her favorites, men who shared her bed and her throne. What those records often omit is that the Jiang brothers also ran a network of spies and assassins. They identified political threats, orchestrated false accusations, and personally supervised the torture of prisoners in the palace dungeons. One account from the Old Book of Tang describes Jiang Yizhi interrogating a captured rebel general. The methods he used were the same methods Wu's regime had perfected: psychological torture, sleep deprivation, threats against family members. The rebel general eventually confessed to crimes he didn't commit, was executed, and his entire family enslaved. She broke me so completely that breaking others felt like devotion. Every scream I extracted from prisoners was a prayer to her. Every life I destroyed proved my loyalty. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was her instrument, her weapon, her beloved tool. Jiang Yizhi had become the very thing that had destroyed his own life. This is the darkest truth about Wu Zetian's male harem. She didn't just break men's bodies, she broke their minds. She created a system where victims could only survive by becoming victimizers. The castration, the humiliation, the constant fear, all of it was designed to strip away identity and replace it with absolute dependence on the Empress. And it worked. Some Mianshe came to worship Wu with genuine devotion, not from fear, but from a twisted form of love. They called her Divine Mother, Celestial Empress, the living Buddha. They competed viciously for her attention, sabotaged each other, and informed on rivals. Wu had created a harem where the prisoners fought each other rather than their jailer. This phenomenon, victims becoming perpetrators, isn't unique to Wu's harem. It appears in Nazi concentration camps, Soviet gulags, modern human trafficking rings. The pattern is universal. Break them completely, rebuild them as extensions of your will. Wu didn't invent this, she perfected it. Psychologists today would recognize this as a textbook case of Stockholm Syndrome combined with trauma bonding. The Mianshe had been so completely broken that they identified with their captor and adopted her worldview as their own. Some even defended her after her death, writing poetry praising her wisdom and mercy. The ultimate horror wasn't what Wu did to their bodies, it was what she did to their souls. She took young men with futures, families, and dreams, and she transformed them into extensions of her will. They ceased to be individuals and became living tools of imperial power. Historical documents contain one final chilling detail. In 703 AD, 2 years before Wu's death, she ordered the construction of a new chamber in the northern palace. It was called the Hall of Perfect Reflection. Inside, she commissioned artists to create a massive mural depicting her surrounded by her Mianshe, hundreds of beautiful young men kneeling in worship, offering flowers and gifts to their divine Empress. The mural, 12 meters wide, 4 meters tall, created over 8 months by 16 artists, destroyed in 712 AD, exactly 7 years after Wu's death. At the center of the mural, Wu sat on a golden throne, smiling. Look at them, beautiful, broken, mine. Every emperor before me had his conquered treasures, concubines torn from their families, displayed like jewels. Now I have mine. And unlike those emperors, I remade them. I didn't just take their bodies, I took their souls. That is true power. The mural survived until 712 AD, when Emperor Zhongzong ordered it destroyed, but not before several court artists made sketches. One of these sketches was preserved in a private collection and published in 1958. When you look at the faces of the Mianshe in that sketch, you notice something disturbing. They're all smiling too. They all smiled. Not the forced smiles of prisoners pretending to be happy, but genuine smiles, the smiles of true believers who had been so completely broken and remade that they couldn't imagine any other existence. That was Wu Zetian's final victory. She didn't just enslave men's bodies, she enslaved their souls, so that they loved their enslavement. The story of Wu Zetian's male harem forces us to confront an uncomfortable